Well, let's get reaction now from our correspondent, Trent Murray, who's in Tel Aviv. Trent, thank you so much for your time. So Israel has presented its response to South Africa and, in the main, accusing South Africa of distorting the truth and leaving crucial facts out of its argument. Maybe elaborate a bit on Israel's strategy and reactions.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we always knew Israel was going to mount a robust defence to South Africa's allegations, and we saw today exactly what they had to say. I don't think there were any major surprises there. It was largely what we were expecting, this argument that Hamas is embedding itself within the civilian population as it fights those IDF troops in Gaza, and that unfortunately civilian casualties are always an unintended consequence of war, and stressing that that is just a reality of the facts on the ground, but it does not indicate genocidal intent. I think number two, they pointed to those millions of paper leaflets that they have dropped, the telephone calls, the text messages trying to warn civilians to move away from particular areas where there was going to be heavy fighting with Hamas. Again, trying to indicate that that was a country doing its best to spare the lives of civilians rather than having genocidal intent. And also some of those comments, those inflammatory comments made by senior ministers of the Israeli government, what comments that South Africa used so effectively in its case. Well, the defence to that was those were random comments taken out of context from ministers who had no governmental oversight of this war, trying to stress the fact that the IDF is a hierarchical structure that operates at the direction of the war cabinet, and that in the IDF sort of manifesto, the laws of war, if you will, it makes very plain that civilian lives need to be protected. Again, trying to dispel the idea of a genocidal intent. We knew that this case was always going to be high stakes, very delicate, disturbing at times, given some of the evidence we heard about what Hamas did on October 7th. I think now we will just have to, of course, wait to see which side prevails as those judges go back to deliberate what both sides had to say.
I want to squeeze this point in terms of just some of the things that they were also arguing. They obviously saying that given that the fact that, South Africa and Israel are state to state and are signatories to the convention, that South Africa did not, to its remembrance, did not adequately address the atrocities that Hamas has committed, did not communicate. And these are issues that they could have deliberated on before dragging Israel to the ICJ. I mean, we heard from South Africa, of course, that they had sent a note verbal, and that also that they had condemned, in fact, the atrocities on the 7th of October, when that happened.
Yeah, I mean, this was a kind of a point around almost the back office conversations, wasn't it? How much notice did South Africa give to Israel that it was going to launch this case? Did it try to seek an alternate dispute resolution before, sort of, for want of a better expression, pulling the trigger on this major ICJ case? I mean, one would imagine the accusations that not enough was done to communicate with Israel directly beforehand will need to be backed up by evidence. Certainly the dossier, if you will, of evidence suggests that Israel has presented to judges the idea that there was conversations taking place between Pretoria and Tel Aviv, but they didn't really lead anywhere before this ICJ case was heard. I don't know how serious the judges will take that. I'm not a lawyer, but it would indicate that they were at least having some conversations with SA before this case began. On the Hamas issue, look, I think certainly there's been wall-to-wall coverage of this today in Israel, as you might imagine, and there's been a lot of commentariats on Israeli TV talking about SA's case, and there is a feeling here in Israel that potentially the government of South Africa could have done more to criticise what Hamas did, and talk about the atrocities which were carried out on October 7th. I mean, that is an issue up for debate. All I would say is that, having watched some of the vision myself of what happened on October 7th, and I've been to a press screening of it, it was extremely disturbing. And I think for the Israelis, they have just really been shaken to their core by this, and they are extremely emotional about what happened and disturbed by what happened. And I think that is why that formed part of that argument, that they just feel more potentially could have been done by the SA government to sort of I suppose, side with them and offer condolences over what happened on that tragic day.
Just in terms of next steps, the court says, as you've pointed out, it needs time to then deliberate, but will be in touch with the two parties when needed before it makes its decision. Just give us a sense of the timeframes.
Yeah, so I think two key timeframes we're looking at. The first one is the longer term decision on whether genocide or not is taking place. Now that could take months, potentially even years. That's a long case that will need to be argued in the ICJ. But I think more crucially, the one we're watching is SA's request for an injunction, effectively for the court to step in and place a restraining order on Israel in Gaza while it debates the merits of this case. Now that could come very quickly, 1 to 2 weeks, and depending on how they decide that request, well, it could have a major change of what the IDF does on the ground. If, and I don't, we are jumping ahead of ourselves, but for the sake of the argument, let's do it. If they do agree with SA's request to implement a restraining order effectively, then it'll put huge pressure on Israel around how it responds to that. Does it agree and wind back or scale back its operations in Gaza, or does it ignore it and continue to push forward with its military goals? If it ignores it, well, one could certainly see a situation where that causes huge diplomatic pressure on them, because for the likes of America, for Germany, two of Israel's biggest allies, they suddenly will be placed in a position of internationally having to defend their ally breaching international law. So look, there is no doubt this is a huge case of major consequence and a high stakes debate effectively around what happens next. And hanging in the balance is that major conflict that continues to rage in Gaza, in a place where 2.3 million people live.
And just to that point of, what happens now, I would imagine a lot of people are asking themselves now that this procedure is over, what is going to happen in as far as the conflict is concerned? There are a couple of moving parts in that sense. I mean, the situation in Yemen being one of them. But I'd like a sense of the outcome, from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to the Middle East. What are we expecting from that front? Did it yield any results?
Well, look, we haven't had any sort of major policy announcements or shifts in position from that visit, but I don't think there ever was an expectation that would occur. I think for Secretary Blinken and the Americans, for them it was just extremely important to speak, not just to Israel, but also the big heavyweights of this region like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. And I think those conversations, whilst not yielding any major shifts or announcements, were fruitful, because he was able to bring back a message from those Arab neighbours of Israel here to the leaders in Tel Aviv and stress a message that for them they are really concerned about what's going on in Gaza. And the longer that this continues, the more risk grows of not only the regional conflict kind of expanding, but also for their future relations with the likes of Saudi Arabia being damaged. And so I think probably what we saw as well from the Americans was what we were hearing privately, that they are growing concerned about the mounting death toll. And Secretary Blinken, in his comments here in Tel Aviv, said he reiterated to Benjamin Netanyahu the need to spare the lives of civilians and also to get more humanitarian aid in. I think the one major outcome we saw, not a huge one, but it's still something, was Israel agreed to a UN inspector being allowed to be put into Gaza to monitor the humanitarian situation. We expect there'll be some movement in there based on how the UN handles the logistics of that quite soon.
Trent Murray, thank you so much for your time.